My name is Cooper Thomas. I'm a product designer on the StoryMaps team, and I'm joined by...
I'm Steve. I'm one of the developers on the StoryMaps team.
I'm also Steven, also one of the developers on the StoryMaps team.
Thanks so much for joining us today for StoryMaps Designing a Lovable Product. This is kind of a peek behind the screen, looking at some of the principles that we've invoked and the processes that we've implemented as we begin to design and develop the next generation of Esri's storytelling apps. If you're here because you want tips and tricks on designing or building a better story map, your best bet is actually just to stop by our session. Here we're really going to be looking at our process for building the product itself. So over the course of the next hour or so, I'm going to provide a little bit of context around story maps, their sort of genesis and history over the past several years. Look at how we actually define a lovable product, what that means, and how we've sort of interpreted that and applied it to our own work. Talk a little bit about our design process, where we start and where we end. And then I'm going to hand it over to Steve to talk about some developer things. And then Steve is also going to bring it home with some more tips and tricks and best practices for accessibility and internationalization and so forth. Just by show of hands, how many of you are familiar with story maps? Sweet, pretty much all of you. And how many have actually created a story map before? Awesome. Well, that's great. So this will probably be somewhat familiar to you, but if you're not familiar with story maps, it's basically a suite of configurable applications in ArcGIS Online. There are about 6 different templates, I think, maybe 7. Anyway, there are enough templates that we've kind of lost track. And there are currently over 800,000 story maps just in ArcGIS Online alone, with presumably hundreds of thousands more in enterprise or portal environments. So we've been really tremendously excited with the success of story maps over the past 6 or 7 years since they were first conceived as these configurable apps. But at the same time, for a while now, we've recognized that we want to actually rebuild and redesign the app from the ground up. And there are a few different reasons for this. The first of which is, as I just mentioned, we currently have 6 different templates, each with its own unique authoring experience, its sort of unique look and feel. And as an author, it's very difficult to sort of move from one template to another, both conceptually because they're designed differently and the sort of workflows are very different, but also functionally. When you start creating a story map currently, you have to choose a template and you're then sort of locked into that experience. So one of our primary goals for rebuilding story maps is to create and consolidate sort of a unified UX where you still have access to all the best bits and pieces of these different templates, but in a single consolidated authoring environment. Another reason, and this is kind of related, that we want to rebuild and redesign story maps is to enable more creative storytelling. And what I mean by that is we want to allow people to mix and match different components and different kinds of sort of story narrative experiences in a single environment. So instead of having to create a map tour and then maybe take that map tour, copy the URL, and embed it into a cascade or a journal or something, you can do that all in a single environment. And we think this will actually enable people to be a little bit more creative, to come up with more novel sort of narrative flows, mixing and matching different components as they see fit, really to tell the story the way they want to. A third and really important reason is to consolidate the code base. Because we have so many different templates right now that we maintain, whenever we have to push out updates, it's a very laborious process, and it means that updating the apps is very slow and costly for us now. And so by basically creating a single mega code base for the entire StoryMaps platform, we're essentially lowering the cost to pushing out updates, which means that we'll be able to deliver updates and introduce new features with a much more regular and quicker cadence than we have been historically, which is really exciting for us. But we think it'll also be really exciting for the end users who will be able to see these new updates and new features and so forth much more rapidly than they currently do. And I think a fourth and really critical reason is just to modernize the apps in terms of performance and accessibility. The first StoryMaps template was built, 6 years ago or so. And so they're a little bit slow. They haven't really been optimized using the latest technologies. And Steve are going to talk about that a little bit more farther down the road, how we're really harnessing the latest tools and techniques to ensure that they're really performant, that they work great across countries and in different languages, and that they're fully accessible for those with visual impairments or other accessibility needs. So if you were in our session earlier this morning, an introduction to the next generation story maps, you might have already seen this video. But if you haven't, I think you'll find this pretty neat. This is a little teaser that we put together. If I can find my cursor here. I'm just going to jump out. Oh, there we go. Oops. Bear with me here for just a second. This is a little teaser that we put together for FedGIS that kind of highlights some of the key capabilities and features that we're introducing with this new version of StoryMaps. I'm not sure if this... This is why you test
really
before you do it?
For a lot of people to find their voice and to... We have almost 750,000 story maps that have been authored in the last 7 years. We have almost 750,000 story maps that have been authored in the last 7 years, and that thrills us. We're so excited by the success of story maps. They've become a really natural way for a lot of people to find their voice and to bring their content together, whether it's their maps, their narratives, the photographs, to weave these things together. And I'm really pleased to announce that we've made major changes to StoryMaps for 2019, and I'm really excited to be able to show this today. The new builder allows you to mix and match different blocks together to tell your story the way you want to tell it. Previously, you've had to choose one of 8 templates. We had templates like Journal and Cascade, and they've been enormously popular, but what we wanted to do was build one place where you could bring the best of all of those templates together and mix and match and move blocks around and really find the right way to tell your story. Whether it's mostly maps, mostly photographs with a lot of narrative, you can find the right home for that content in the new builder. One of the things that we've heard from folks is they need simple maps. They need to be able to add simple reference maps, locator maps, things that show like a study area or a couple push pins that show where potential site locations are. And you want to be able to click on those push pins and just get a couple basic facts. So what we've built is something called Express Maps, which allow you to author simple maps directly in the builder without having to leave. And we've really streamlined the workflow. If you've made a story, you know one of the most time-consuming things is having to visually harmonize all the elements because you're making things in different places. So you have to remember what fonts you used, what colors you used, what the background color is, how much line spacing, all those little details really take a lot of time to get right. With one-click themes, we take care of this for you. With one-click themes, you can change the tone of your story. Finding the right tone to tell your story, the right visual tone, is a really important part of a narrative. And one-click themes will continue to evolve in the future. One of the things we've heard is that you often need to share your story before you can publish it. You need to show it to your boss. You need to show it to your colleagues. You want their input. I'm really pleased to announce that we've introduced draft mode. And what draft mode allows you to do is to share a story before it's public to get feedback. Even better, we've introduced, once the story is published, the ability to make further edits and decide when you want those edits to go live. So if you want to make edits on a Tuesday but republish the story on a Friday, you can do that now. Mobile first is everything these days. What we know is that most of us consume digital content through our phones. Therefore, as designers, we have to have that in mind. And so with a mobile first approach, we've made sure to do all of the hard work, all the heavy lifting behind the scenes so that you don't have to optimize your photographs and your web maps and all of these other things that are going to be delivered to that device. We do this automatically behind the scenes so that you don't have to worry about it. What it means is that regardless of where your audience is coming from and how they're reaching you, their experience is going to be amazing.
So hopefully that video gives you just a little bit of taste of what's coming later this year. In terms of timeline, we're currently in kind of a private alpha stage now. We're releasing a public beta in early April, and anyone with an ArcGIS Online account will be able to sign up and create story maps using this new version of the application. And we're currently targeting a public release around UC in July of 2019. So stay tuned for more details on that.
We have
I think it's really helpful too, before we start talking about our process, to kind of define what a lovable product is and how we've interpreted that within the context of StoryMaps. And depending on whom you ask, you might get a ton of different answers. A lovable product enables users to achieve some desired outcome while simultaneously providing a pleasurable and memorable experience. A lovable product makes users' lives easier and delivers delight. A lovable product turns regular users into outspoken advocates. These are just a few different sort of definitions of what a lovable product really is. But I think it's really helpful to think about a lovable product within sort of the framework or context of user needs. And a really useful sort of system for thinking about this is this pyramid of user needs, which is an adaptation of Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, which has basically been adapted for digital products. And so the basic idea here is that in order to create a lovable product, you basically need to fulfill all of these individual needs from the ground up. So a product should first and foremost be functional. It should fulfill the basic requirements of the user and allow them to complete whatever task it is or whatever goal it is that they're trying to achieve. Then it should be reliable. It shouldn't break down and fail them when they really need it to work. It should do what they want it to do as they expect it to do. Third, it should be usable. What this means is that it's intuitive and it's kind of easy to use. It's understandable. It makes sense. And the fourth and final one is that it's pleasurable. It should sort of deliver some measure of delight. It should be enjoyable to use. It shouldn't just be sort of a sterile experience that doesn't really engage the user in any way. It should actually evoke some sort of maybe positive emotional response. And these, again, should be sort of completed from the ground up, but in many cases we see companies delivering products that only fulfill maybe some of these needs. So for instance, if you only ship a product that fulfills this top need and is a very pleasurable product, it might be really enjoyable to look at or to interact with, but it doesn't provide any sort of sustainable benefit to your users. A common example of this is Clippy from Microsoft Office. I don't know when this was, Microsoft XP or Windows 2000. But Clippy was really fun and it had all these goofy animations and so forth. But if you actually tried to use Clippy to solve any of your problems, chances are he or it would probably fail you. And because of the negativity bias, the fact that people tend to cling to negative aspects of products more than positive ones, if you have a product that delivers this surface delight but no real actual sustainable value, you can really lose a lot of support from your core user base. These concepts are also often talked about or invoked within the context of minimum viable products and minimum lovable products. So a couple other examples here. A minimum viable product just tries to provide some basic measure of functionality. It's kind of the leanest, the smallest possible product that allows users to achieve some end goal. Similarly, a minimum lovable product, instead of focusing just on functionality, attempts to sort of slice through the entire pyramid. It won't be as feature complete as a minimum viable product. In fact, it may only provide a couple, sort of core features, but it will deliver these experiences in a way that's really delightful for the end user. And that sort of inspires, loyalty to the product and actually makes people excited to use the product. And of course, a fully lovable product, kind of the unicorn product, fulfills all of these needs completely. And most products fail to do this, and it's a good goal to shoot for, but realistically, it's really, really difficult to complete all of these needs, both because audiences tend to have different needs and expectations within a particular sort of user community. And it's also just difficult to make the perfect thing. And I think it's important to recognize that when you begin building a product, knowing that no matter how hard you work, you're probably still going to have some detractors or some people that aren't fully satisfied, and that's just kind of inevitable, I think. So a lovable story maps, what does that look like for us? Well, it's a product that inspires creativity rather than stifling it. Again, this comes back to what I said earlier about creating a unified builder that allows authors to mix and match different pieces. We don't want them to feel like they're kind of locked into a specific narrative experience. We want them to be able to express themselves however they see fit by being able to pull on all these different sort of components or tools in one integrated authoring experience. I think a helpful way to think about a lovable story maps is that it should kind of operate like a really knowledgeable sous chef or like a surgeon's assistant. It should be able to provide the appropriate tool or instrument right when it's needed, but otherwise kind of stays out of the way. In fact, a user shouldn't really even be thinking about or noticing the UX and the UI as they're going through the story authoring process. It should just be there when they need it, as they need it. And third, we want story maps to be easy to learn but have a high skill ceiling. What we mean by that is we want folks to be able to pick up and run with story maps, whether they've created story maps in the past or whether this is their first foray into multimedia storytelling. But at the same time, we want to ensure that power users still feel like they have the flexibility and the control that they need to tell really robust, compelling stories, maybe using some more advanced techniques. We don't want the software, the application itself, to sort of limit their potential or prevent them from creating the stories that they want by imposing really strict constraints. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our process, how we've actually gone about designing and building this future generation of story map apps. And it's broken down into 4 general stages. The first is research, and this is probably the most important stage. And this is where we try and understand our users' fundamental needs and expectations, their perceptions of the product as it exists now, and what they really expect from the next generation of story maps. Then the planning stage, where we kind of identify or define product requirements and time box the different stages. Then the designing stage, where we actually come up with mockups and prototypes and user flows and try and actually build out the individual components that'll appear in the final app. And then finally, the implementation stage, where we hand these components off to the developers and they actually sort of bring it to life. One thing I really want to emphasize here is the importance of short feedback loops between all of these different stages. That's what these kind of teal arrows indicate. We think it's really important to constantly solicit feedback both within our team and also with external testers so that we can catch potential issues as quickly as possible and resolve them as quickly as possible. It's pretty obvious that if you wait until the last minute to address a fundamental problem, it's going to be much more costly. So beginning with the research process, again, I think this is really the most important stage of the entire building process, because this is where we really get to understand our users and what they expect. So the primary methods through which we conduct research are threefold. We conduct customer interviews, which are really sort of in-depth, one-on-one interactions with power users across a wide range of personas. And we do this to refine and verify our existing personas. But we also do this to get a really good sense and an honest sense for how they're using the tool, where they see problems, where they've encountered maybe roadblocks in the past. It's a real deep dive into understanding how they actually engage with the product. The next is analytics. So we collect our own analytics on the product to give us a better understanding of how users are using the different templates, how they're actually building their stories, how long their stories are. I've just sort of cherry-picked a chart here that shows image sources in our apps, and this gives us a sense for which features or which tools are really important for users. In this case, we can see that the majority of images in StoryMaps are uploaded directly to ArcGIS Online rather than maybe imported from Flickr or Picasa or Google+. And this tells us that we really need to make sure that that uploading experience is totally dialed and that images are well optimized when they're served from ArcGIS Online. Oh, and the third form of research that we conduct are surveys and polls. These are much more informal. We typically administer these either via Twitter or sometimes GeoNet. And these are just sort of good ways of getting a pulse on specific features, seeing how a wider audience maybe reacts to proposals for new features that we're potentially introducing. And one thing that's really cool about these is that when we do conduct these polls in a public forum like GeoNet or like Twitter, we often stimulate discussions that otherwise that otherwise wouldn't occur between users themselves. And that can be a really valuable way, again, for us to sort of extract really important and actionable nuggets of information on how people are actually using the product. So that's the planning stage. The outcome of this planning stage, or I guess like the deliverable for this planning stage, are like feature requirements or business rules if it's a specific feature. And, oops, sorry, I just jumped ahead here. The research stage, the planning stage, this is where we actually sort of define those functional requirements and individual feature needs. And this is also where we set milestones. Our team uses the agile method, so we're on 2-week sprint cycles. And we have sort of a research, design, and development team division, and those sprints are staggered. So it typically works is that the research folks will tackle one ticket in one sprint, and then the following sprint, the design team will actually try and build out or mock up that particular idea or that feature. And then in the third sprint, the developers will actually go ahead and implement it. The third stage is the design stage, and this is this can really be broken down into a number of different constituent steps. But before I dive into actually the process of designing individual features, we've basically built out a component library or a design system that allows us to reuse components and individual sort of stylistic attributes across the entire product. And this is really useful both for consolidating that visual language that we're trying to achieve, which is itself sort of derived from brand traits and other sort of key aspects of sort of what we envision this product to be. And it also ensures that the developers don't need to duplicate efforts by constantly sort of rebuilding or redesigning components that are used throughout the entire system. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, and I think Steve will too. And so this design system, we use a tool called Abstract, which is basically kind of like, well, it's like basically a repository online that contains individual components, but it also has sort of a version control system, which allows us to iterate really quickly on visual designs, which is great. So designers can be working on similar overlapping features simultaneously without sort of duplicating work or overwriting each other's changes. This is just a screenshot of a business rule on Confluence. Confluence is another tool that we use. It's sort of just like a internal knowledge base that basically documents all of the specific business rules. In this case, basically the typographic rules that we're invoking for the entire sort of app ecosystem. So the actual design process itself can be broken down into three general stages. The first is developing user flows, kind of understanding the steps that a user takes to achieve a specific goal. The second is building out wireframes or mockups, and the third is actually building out those individual components. So user flows, depending on how complex the action is, sometimes this is just a simple sort of text note. When it is a more complex interaction, like in this case, the process of publishing or unpublishing, sharing or unsharing a story, we'll often come up with diagrams like these. And creating these visual diagrams is actually really helpful for us because it helps highlight potential dead ends in the UX or loops in the UX where maybe a user might sort of be cycled through the same steps over and over again, which can be really aggravating as a user. Or maybe they'll try and do something and they'll basically hit a dead end and there won't be any path forward for them, which is also kind of an undesirable outcome. And then the next is actually building out wireframes or mockups. Again, because we're using Abstract and this component library, we've sort of moved away from using other tools like Balsamiq to build out sort of very rough wireframes. Instead, because we have this component library, it's just as fast for us to build mockups by pulling in those individual components. And this is, again, a very iterative process. We can go through dozens or maybe even hundreds of iterations of a specific feature or workflow before we're really satisfied with it. But again, that's totally enabled by this version control system and component library that Abstract provides. And the final deliverable from this design stage is a set of components that lives on Abstract. And these include styling rules like this, specific CSS rules. And the developers can then go directly into abstract and sort of grab those style rules and apply them to the stuff that they're building, which goes way over my head. And so that's kind of the design process in a nutshell. I kind of breezed through that really quickly, but I'm going to turn it over to Steve now to talk about the developing and implementation stage.
Great. So this is what you've seen up to this point is where our design team really comes into place and our editorial research team kind of comes into place. But once we finish that, now we actually have to go and take these great designs and put them in the product. And so this is where we start implementing these designs. So what does that look like on our team? It first kind of starts with a design handoff. I'll talk through that process a little bit more in a second. We go back and prioritize the scope of how can we get these designs into subsequent releases, and do we bring everything all at once? Do we bring them over time into bigger features? Once we know what the scope is, then we go back and actually start developing our own component library on the dev side of things. So we actually have two different component libraries. We have the design system component library, which lives on Abstract. So as designers create designs in Sketch, they publish those to Abstract, which is our full design system. They can share components, and they can create high fidelity mockups that share those components. But then on the dev side, we then create a second component system, which is the full live component ready to go into the product, into a new page where it's going to use, say, a button. We're going to actually use the live button component that we've coded out. Once we have those components, then we compile those into the pages or the application workflows that we have designed. Go through a test and review process to ensure everything matches spec. It's reliable. It meets all those slices of the design pyramid. Make sure it's documented well. So for maintenance sake, it's a lot easier for us if things are documented well. We can come back to it. We know what's happening, whether it's inline documentation, whether it's how to use this component documentation, or whether it's external customer documentation, how they can understand how to use the product itself. And a lot of times, because we're doing these in small scope periods at a time, it's an iterative process where we start with one small slice of the feature and continue to grow that over time. So we're just going through this cycle over and over again until we've fully fleshed out that product. So for the design handoff, what does that take to get designs over to developers in a way that they can fully and 100% meet the design spec? First and foremost, documentation is really the most important thing. What you see scrolling by here is what one of our design documents look like. And this is really the amount of work we're going in for designers first to have the business rules in place. How does a component work, whether it's like a publish workflow, what can be published, where can a user publish that story to, whether it's sharing to organization in this flow, or if you have these permissions, you can publish it to publicly and to an organization. What are those business rules? If you have a map, how many layers can you add in a map? How many points can you add in a map? So a developer should be able to completely and 100% understand what is going to happen in their application. Besides business rules, we also have those user flow diagrams. If I click on this button, where am I going to go? When I go to that place, what does that look like? Again, everything we want to try to make all the designs first. The more we have designs first, for the most part, designs are a lot cheaper than development. If you can focus on good design, a lot of times you're going to save a lot of money and a lot of your budget on developing your app, because you don't have to develop that app 3 different times until it finally works. Because you can verify a lot of those tests by mockups and animations and different tools that we use. Along with user flow diagrams, because we live in such a mobile-first approach, all the designs have to be designed for smartphones from day one. We won't implement dev unless we actually know there's a smartphone design behind it, because the architecture behind creating for a smartphone really is dependent on the rest of the application as well. Videos of animations and transitions. We need to know how you're going to move from this page to the next page, how the pop-up comes up, so we have a smooth and a polished experience for the end user. And in some cases, even at this point for the design handoff, we have some knowledge that we know in the beta release we're going to have these 4 features for publishing, but in the initial release for June we're going to have 3 more features. So we already have some idea what that might be. We'll flesh that out later in our design review process, but there might be some of those mockups. So finally, beyond the business rules, we also have those high fidelity mockups in abstract, and I'll give you a quick, brief look at what that looks like. So this is abstract. As a developer, I can come into abstract, and I get the full picture of what the developer sees and what the developer needs to implement that to design spec. So as they design in Sketch, we have the CSS rules that we need. We have border radiuses, what that shadow looks like. Is it a 2-pixel border? I can tell because it says it's a 2-pixel border, so I can implement that spec back in my design system. The developers don't have to guess what that looks like because it's a Photoshop image. I can know by spec. And if you notice on the side panel here, you'll see little green, pink icons. In this case, in the design system, those are components that we're using across different pages. So there's a button component that has an icon in pink. I know as a developer, that's a reusable button component. So what am I going to do as a developer? I'm going to create a reusable button component. And now I can know that's going to be reused across all my different pages anywhere I need a button component. So it makes it really easy to match what the design spec is. So the next step, once we get past the design handoff, and this is kind of what designers deliver at the end. And in most cases, this is done in what we call a design review. So this is where we gather all the stakeholders, whether it's product owners, marketers, lead developers, lead product engineers, any other ones that may have influence on and where the product's going or where product requirements going. And so designers will deliver their presentation of like, this is what we think, based on the product requirements, the feature should look like. Devs will buy in and say, yes, that looks good. We can do this from a development standpoint. Product owners will come in and say, yes, this meets the product requirement. Everyone buys in before we even start development. So that's a great place to be. And then once we have that, we then determine what's the scope of this feature. Do we want to do, we break that even farther. If it's not defined in the design handoff, we might break that down to, okay, this is great, developers can do this, but it's going to take 2 months to do this. So we're going to do half the features now, we'll do the other half the features in the next release. And so how can we balance that to make a lovable product so we actually get the entire slice of the pie, but maybe not the whole pyramid at once, right? Then once we do that, once we have the design process, now we start the development planning. So as Cooper mentioned, we have sprint cycles for Agile. Designers on our two-week sprint cycle, they're usually 2 to 3 sprints ahead of us. Developers come in after that and are on our own 2-week sprint cycle. And what we like to do on our dev team is we like to always have releasable sprints, as we call it. So basically, even if in some cases a feature might take 4-6 weeks to implement, that's 3 different sprints. At the end of the first 2 weeks, we want at least something we can release. So product engineers can start testing, product owners can start verifying with our customers that this is the path forward. So far, it's working well. And it also is a great motivator for our devs that they can see this is working, I know how to move forward, or this is not working and we need to go back to designs because this is not working. That's that short feedback loop as well that we have there. So once we have designs in process, we're started planning, the first thing we do is look at what are those components. And we start building out our own component library. And so these are some benefits of why you might want to use a component library. First of all, it's an extremely low investment on your side, but you get a tremendous payoff. In our case, you'll notice we see what the components are, and we develop the components over time as new components come out. We don't start by saying, we need an entire bootstrap library day one before we can start development on anything else. This component needs a button, this component needs a card. Okay, I'm going to develop those 2 components in a way that's reusable. I can use them later, but those are the only 2 components I'm starting with. And we found it's actually a lot better to develop over time because then you actually know the needs of your product. You know how the designs match up with your product because designs are going to change over time. And if you start everything, if you try to get all your components from day one, you actually end up having to redesign a lot of your components later on anyways. It's a lot easier for onboarding for other developers. If you have small bite-sized pieces that they can come and look at, this is the pattern of how we develop our code, they can come back and implement it in their own way in a different new component. It's a lot faster development process because anytime you need to create a button, you don't have to know this is how this default button works, this is the exact color. They don't have to think about how do the labels work on this? How does the text work? Do all the buttons have uppercase text or lowercase text? It only has to be thought out one time. Because there's only one component, there's a lot fewer bugs. There's usually 1 or 2 maintainers on that. They actually understand the product, or they understand the component itself. There's a much lower maintenance cost. As designers say, this is a green button, now it needs to be an orange button. Everywhere you have a button, you've changed it in one place and it automatically updates across your entire code base, as opposed to changing it in 20 different places where you have those components. It improves performance. You only have one component. You have a much smaller bundle size because you've only have one piece of code where that button component lives. At the same time, because you only have to develop it one time, you can usually spend a little bit more time developing that component and optimize it to be the best possible component that it can be. Beyond just the dev side of things, another reason why it's really good to have a component library is it gives you consistent design across your entire application. All your buttons look the same. They function the same way. They open the dialogue in the same way. You have the same animations that come across because they're used everywhere. If you have really specific branding requirements, whenever you create a component, you can develop those branding requirements directly in the component. Anytime someone needs, or those branding requirements directly in the component. So anytime someone needs to use that logo or the title color, they don't have to think about what it is. They don't have to match up the spacing correctly. They don't have to make sure the registered trademark is on there, on the logo. It's already in the component. They just have to say, this is the app logo, put it here, and all the branding requirements come across in your product. So on our team, how do we develop component libraries? There's a great tool right now called StoryBookJS. There's a few other similar tools like StyleGuidist and Doxy. But basically, it's a way to develop components in isolation. I'll show you what this looks like in a second. But basically, you can develop your components in a hot reload. It gives you specific tools for showcasing multiple different uses of that component. You have hot reload so you can quickly see your changes without having to refresh your browser. You have tooling to see if you automatically pass accessibility testing, to test it in left to right and internationalization with different strings. You have built-in documentation tools. There's a lot of different add-ons you can use to just improve your development process. One of the great things about using these isolated component systems is you're thinking about your component as a component as opposed to your component in the context of this page. So it makes it a lot easier to make it a reusable component in different places because you're designing it without the thought of the page itself that it's being placed in. So in our team, we're designing for reusability and sharing. So we have actually 3 different component libraries right now in our current product. We have our core component library that's built on Storybook. And you can think of this kind of like our CSS framework or our Bootstrap, where we have core components. There's very little dependencies. Things that are in there are things like our button component, our card component, an image, just a very basic image component, a very basic video player component. On top of that, we use those core components and we build what we have our story viewer or builder components. So these are all the components in our application that make up the actual story itself or the story editor. And so we'll use those core components and build larger, more complex components on top of those to have a full workflow for, if it's an image, the full image player with caption beneath it and the text editor, and we'll combine those components together. So we can reuse those core components. We can share only the components that need to be shared with different teams because we're using a monorepo structure. All the code is actually separated out into a different package. And our third one is our website or ecosystem component. So as we develop different pages, like my stories that aren't actually in the story viewer, or later on we might have like an explorer or publisher page, those go into our ecosystem storybook. And so they're separated out. So when you load our story viewer, you're only getting the components that you need for the story viewer so we can be as performant as possible and the load size is as small as possible. So what does that storybook look like? This is kind of what you see as a developer. You'll notice here, so in this case, I might be developing this search box here that you see. So I've got a list of all the components that is currently in this storybook. I can click on the one I'm working on, and there's a drop-down list beneath that accordion that has all the different versions. So if I'm working on a button, there might be a button, a default button, an outline button, and a button group. all right next to each other, so I can quickly switch between which one I'm looking at. In this case, I have the search box here. So the other great thing, it has callback events. So if you have callback events in your component, you can actually see the events being taking place in this tool panel. So as I type in the search box, I can actually see what's getting called back that would get called back in the context of my application. I can click around and see, run an accessibility test to see if there's any failures right away. I can test this in a left to right setting. And if you notice here on this top right, there's this little show info. So when other developers from the team come and they want to use this component in their application, they can click that show info button, and they have built-in documentation for how to use that component. Most of this documentation is actually automatically generated for us. So we're using TypeScript on our application. If you see this table of properties here, we have a couple inline comments, but for the most part, it's just TypeScript that creates this entire table for us. The storybook component automatically gives the example usage of how a developer would use this application. And then if there's any small additional notes, we can just write a simple markdown README that gets incorporated into this documentation. So the great thing about this workflow is we get to ease the development process. They don't have to focus as much on creating the documentation, but we still get reusable components that's well documented and is reliable for other developers as they come back in the future to maintain it over time. So a couple tips we found as we're creating a component library: develop in isolation. It really helps to focus on building your components not in the context where they're initially used in the first page that the designers give you, but develop it in that storybook or in a standalone demo page where all you see is the component itself, and it really helps you to focus on that specific component and what makes that component best. Also, make sure you write clear, concise documentation. Inline comments are great because as developers come back and they need to maintain it over time, they can easily see why you chose to put this additional function in because IE needed this extra code to make it work correctly. Document how to use it. The storybook will do that for you automatically with that documentation add-on. Add just enough configuration. So one of the things about a component library is we want to make it a consistent user experience across all of our pages. So if you have too many different customization options, one, it makes it a lot harder to use the components, and the developers aren't going to end up using the components if they have to fill out 20 different configuration options, and it's just too difficult to use. But the other thing, if you have too many different configuration options, then you don't really have a component library anyways, because every time the button's used, it looks differently than it was on a different page. And last but not least, and I think this is missed by a lot of other blogs that are out there, make sure you're adding hooks in at the component level for accessibility and internationalization. A lot of times, especially for accessibility, it works best if you're doing it within the context of the page or the larger pattern component that you're building. So if you don't have those in, you can't really get a fully accessible page. And for internationalization, so in our case, we have that core component CSS library that we can share with other teams or other customers. We don't have any kind of string files in there. We don't know what languages are going to be used in the future, what language requirements if another team might need in general. So we don't even bake that in. We just provide hooks so they can provide their own strings for the button or the closed component of a modal or things like that. So that's our component library. As we move forward, we also want to talk about how we can create a reliable application. So this is just a brief look at what we do on our team to make sure our application is reliable and well tested and reviewed. Static tests are kind of a given these days, whether it's through ESLint or TSLint or TypeScript type checking for you. Basically, just make sure you're not missing the simple kind of poor errors that a new developer would get, or if you accidentally missed a comma or something like that, it fixes a lot of those common bugs for you. Or you were expecting an object, but you passed it a number, that test is not going to fail for you. Unit integration test, just make sure your code is reliable from the ground up. On our team, all the devs, as they contribute code to our main repo, they're always writing tests right in place as they go. And just the more you write tests up front, it's a lot easier to see what's going on. Tests are also a great way to show how that function is supposed to be used, because as you test the function, it's tested in the way that it's supposed to be used. Also a couple failing use cases as well. Snapshot test, this has kind of been made a little bit more popular by the new JS snapshot utility that they have open. And I found this is pretty good for if you're developing a very simple core CSS framework library. In a more complex component library, it sometimes falls apart. But it basically helps you see if there's any unexpected changes in your application. It basically says it will render your component once, and then the next time the test runs, it'll render it again and compare those two renders to see if there's any changes in the HTML structure or CSS. So it just helps you to see everything that's changed and just know if you've changed a button that all of a sudden your mobile component doesn't have CSS changes in it. So it's just a way to keep track of what's happening. Lighthouse accessibility testing, it's a tool used created by Google. You can run it in a CI pipeline. You can run it on your browser, dev tools. It's a great way to see if you have any accessibility rules that are failing, just best practices, server performance timing, see if you have good performance. You're using best practices for progressive web apps and other just modern web best practices. End-to-end testing just kind of brings everything together. This can be done in a couple of different ways. You can do it automated testing and have workflows set up that you kind of have a script that runs through full workflows, like a sign-in workflow or a publish workflow that touches every piece in the fully rendered browser. A lot of times this is also manual testing by a testing team. In our case, we use a testing team that will go through and just try to pound on the application and see if things break. A couple other things. Once we have all the tests in place, we also do code reviews. Before any code gets merged in, we have a couple different people look at the code to see if everything makes sense. Does it seem reliable? Are there any ways we can make this more reusable? Make sure if we're missing any components that this piece of code should actually be broken out in another component. And also, does this component match design spec? That's the other thing we want to do. So what makes that component dev complete? It matches design spec. It's been reviewed. It's fully tested. It's fully documented. It matches. It has the responsive design that it needs from day one. It matches the full desktop design system. It's fast. We're not going to release a feature into our StoryMaps unless it's really fast. And there might be some features we want to add, but we know that performance is key to our customers. And so if we can't get it fast, we're not going to release it. It's accessible. In some cases, people that have disabilities, sometimes you think that it's only 2 or 5% of your customers that are coming. But if you think about in their instance, if that's what everyone's thinking, that's 90% of their web for them that is not accessible to them. And so it's really important to make sure you're looking out for all your customers, because that can also be a significant chunk of your revenue if you're focusing on who your customers are. And it's internationalized. It works for all different countries, whether it's string files. And that's a lot more than just translating your application. And Steve's going to cover some of these topics now for us.
Hey, everyone. So I'm going to briefly go through a couple best practices and tips for front-end web development in general. By a show of hands, how many of you are developers day in and day out? OK. Good. So these are just some different aspects of a Loveable product. We've talked a little bit about what that means at a high level and also our process and from a design standpoint. So in terms of implementing this in a way that customers and users can be happy with, due to time, we'll probably just talk about the first couple. So probably the most important one that I want to touch on today is performance. So how can you make your application more performant? This is something that is becoming increasingly important, especially with mobile devices becoming more and more ubiquitous. Performance matters even more there. So one of the first things I want to talk about is just the importance of using suitable image sizes. Make sure that you are not using a huge, beautiful 2,000 pixel wide image on a mobile phone. One thing that can be helpful to do there in terms of specific tips is using the source set and sizes attributes on image tags. So the source set allows you to list out all the different images, sizes that you have of the same image. And then the sizes attribute allows you to tell the computer basically, hey, at this screen width, use this image. And that's generally how it works. Another one that we've found pretty helpful is lazy loading. So users don't generally care about what they don't see. So wait to load media that is off screen. This could include maps, images, web scenes, etc. And so, of course, this gives you a speedier initial load, and then you can basically load in that media as soon as it's starting to come into view. One thing that can be really helpful with that is the intersection observer web API. We've started to use this on our team. It allows you to avoid having to use scroll listeners or other really unperformant ways of detecting when elements are about to become on screen or off. So, of course, be aware that support isn't ubiquitous yet, but it's getting there. Another thing that we've found, and this is kind of a specific, but we found it to be helpful for improving performance, is server-side rendering. And this is really pretty cool. So instead of rendering your markup on the client with JavaScript templating libraries, frameworks, etc., the markup is rendered server-side. So just a brief diagram. We see a application lifecycle right here. So the user, first of all, of course, enters the URL, and then with server-side rendering, the server actually executes the application code and then returns the full markup and styles of the app or the page back to the browser. So immediately, as soon as that request is returned, you have a viewable page for your users. And then, of course, after that, you have the files that are requested for scripts that are returned to make the application interactable. But it allows users to see your page sooner than they otherwise would. So that's good for first impressions. Also has some benefits with search engine optimization. Another good one that you can consider, and something that we're considering adding in the future, is static web maps or web scenes. So this would be having a static image, a screenshot of a map or a scene, and then using that either as a replacement for maybe a slow device or a bad internet connection, or as a placeholder until the web map or web scene is loaded, at which time you can switch it out. Let's talk a little bit about accessibility last of all, and then we'll be done. Okay, there's way more that I can cover here, but kind of like Stephen mentioned, it's good to be thinking of accessibility from the get-go. Some really easy things to do are just to use the right tags for the right job, buttons, tags for buttons, etc. Having descriptive text that's there in case an image or a video doesn't load, or especially for screen readers, for those that wouldn't be able to view those media anyway. Having the application navigable by keyboard for people that aren't able to use mice or don't have a mouse. And then, of course, color contrast. This could go from the whole spectrum of people that have slight color blindness to those that have severe vision impairments. Another key aspect in this regard is on mobile to not disable browser zoom. So a lot of users need to be able to pinch to view text at a larger size. So these are some tips that we hope you can find helpful in terms of specifics.